Hi, folks, and welcome to the Brazilian Grand Prix podcast with myself, Manish Patel. Wow, what a fantastic Brazilian Grand Prix! Thank you, Interlagos, for giving us another thrilling race. Interlagos and Brazil always seems to have that knack, doesn't it, of giving us a fantastic race, whether that would be in the wet or in the dry, and this year was no different. So, thank you, Interlagos, once again for giving us a brilliant race. A race that was won by Red Bull Racing's Max Verstappen. Fantastic performance throughout the whole weekend from the Dutchman, and we'll go on to discuss Max later on, quite soon actually in this podcast. But it was also a race of firsts where Pierre Gasly took his first ever podium in Formula One. Really strong weekend for the Frenchman, and again we'll talk about Gasly's weekend in Brazil. And initially, it was Lewis Hamilton who took the third step, the podium, but because he was given a 5-second penalty for causing a collision, that meant that Carlos Sainz took his first ever podium in Formula One and McLaren's first podium since 2014. So a race of firsts, and we'll go on to talk about Gasly and Sainz's weekends pretty soon. But first, I want to start with Max Verstappen and Red Bull. I think the one word that you can use to describe Max's weekend in Brazil was faultless. No mistakes whatsoever from the Dutchman. Brilliant lap from Verstappen in qualifying on Saturday to put the car on pole, and then in the race he looked in control when he was out in front, and where he had some fantastic battles with Lewis Hamilton in the race as well, which he was able to come out on top of. And to be honest, Verstappen really did deserve his race victory. I think even after the safety car, on 2 occasions, he was able to really control the pace. His restarts were very good as well. So for me, Verstappen thoroughly deserved his win in Brazil, and I think he would have definitely been fired up to win this weekend's race in Brazil, especially after what happened in last year's race where he tangled with Esteban Ocon, and it was a race where he was dominating up until that instant. But this time round, in this year's race, Verstappen, fantastic performance from the Dutchman throughout the whole weekend, and he probably deserved the win in Brazil. So well done to Max Verstappen. But as for Red Bull and as for the team, it could so easily have been a 1-2 with Alexander Albon in the closing stages looking well set for at least a podium finish, and he could so easily have been the second step on the podium. But that was taken away from Albon by Lewis Hamilton, who unfortunately caused the collision. So my thoughts on the collision: there was a gap for Lewis to go into initially, but as the door was slightly getting closed by Albon, the gap started to close, and unfortunately the two tangled together, which sent Albon spinning, and Lewis did carry on, but was then given a 5-second penalty. It was the right decision, in my opinion, and these things happen in Formula One, and Lewis, we all make mistakes, and unfortunately that was a mistake from Lewis's part. But the good thing about that incident was the fact that Lewis straight away after the race went up to Albon to apologise, and that's great to see. And you need to see more of that. And but a real shame for Albon, because now he's done a really good job ever since he's been at Red Bull, and it's just unfortunate that the way that his race ended. So really unfortunate for Albon, but I know his time will come, and I know that he will finish on the podium really soon. So whether that will be Abu Dhabi, we'll have to wait and see. But I can definitely see Alexander Albon being on the podium in 2020 with Red Bull. So unfortunate for Albon, but a fantastic race for Max Verstappen. And speaking of the podium, what a fantastic weekend and drive from Pierre Gasly, who has had a turbulent year, I should say. Let's be honest, first year with Red Bull wasn't bad actually. It wasn't brilliant, but it wasn't as good as it should have been. So not the best of first halves to the season for Pierre Gasly. But second half of the season, going back to Toro Rosso, and I said this in the previous podcast, he just seems to be so much more happier. He seems to be so much more comfortable in the team settings and team environment at Toro Rosso with less pressure. And this weekend in Brazil, the weekend at Brazil, he put in a strong performance throughout the whole weekend. He was able to qualify 7th on Saturday. And then the race pace of Toro Rosso was pretty impressive, actually. It wasn't right up there with the Red Bulls and Mercedes and the Ferraris, but Gasly was running his own race, and the safety cars, when they came out, really brought him into play, and Gasly was in the right place at the right time to pounce on the Ferrari clash, but also the Hamilton and Albon collision, and Gasly was in prime position, I should say, to take advantage of those situations. So, Gasly I'm really happy for him, and I think the whole paddock in Formula One are really happy for the Frenchman to finally be on the podium. But well, I shouldn't really say finally, actually, because let's not forget this is only his second season in Formula One. But I think for Pierre Gasly, knowing that he's now been on the Formula One podium, I think it takes that monkey off his shoulder. But yeah, no, really happy for Gasly, and he deserves it. And let's not forget, this is Toro Rosso's second podium of the season after Danny Kvyat's podium in Germany. So this year's been a really encouraging year for Toro Rosso, and if this is a sign of things to come, then they could be in amongst the top of the midfield next season. They really could. And of course, there's a battle for 5th in the constructors with Renault to settle at Abu Dhabi, which we'll go on to discuss later when I touch on Renault. But as for Kvyat, not a bad weekend. So managed to pick up a point for Toro Rosso, and every point helps. So not a most straightforward weekend for Danny Kvyat, but yeah, a good point for the Russian, and obviously a great weekend for the team, and personally a fantastic weekend for Pierre Gasly. So many congratulations, Pierre, on your first podium in Formula One, and hopefully that is the first of many to come for the Frenchman. And once again, speaking of first ever podiums, Carlos Sainz. Many congratulations to Carlos Sainz for ending up on the podium and taking McLaren's first podium since 2014. So, as I mentioned, initially it was Lewis Hamilton who took the third step the podium, but because he got that 5-second penalty, that promoted Sainz up to third. And it was great to see Carlos given the opportunity to go onto the podium and celebrate the podium with his team as well. It's been a really encouraging 2019 for McLaren. I don't think anyone outside of McLaren would have expected to see McLaren where they are, but the amount of progress they've made this year has been quite incredible. And if this is the sign of things to come, then you just never know what's possible for McLaren next season. But as for Carlos himself, what a fantastic drive from the back of the field, bearing in mind he had a loss of power in qualifying on Saturday, to fight his way through the field the way he did and to finish 4th and then get promoted to 3rd, without a doubt, for me, a contender for driver of the day alongside Pierre Gasly. But yeah, no, fantastic weekend for Carlos Sainz. And Lando Norris, not the most straightforward of weekends for the British driver. Still came home in 8th, so really valuable points for McLaren. He did have a stint on the hard tyre where he quite struggled, really, but even so, Lando was still able to pick up some good points for McLaren. And because Lando finished in 8th, and Carlos was able to finish on the 3rd step of the podium, that meant that McLaren secured 4th place in the Constructors. Who would have thought that at the start of the season, bearing in mind what has happened at McLaren in previous seasons? But yeah, no, I'm really happy for everyone at McLaren, and we want to see, as a neutral, I think we all want to see McLaren at the front of the field, challenging for race wins, challenging for podiums on a regular basis, because that is where they should be. But once again, huge congratulations to Carlos Sainz on his first ever podium in Formula One, and like Gasly, hopefully the first of many for Carlos Sainz. And the resurgence at McLaren continues. So another team who had another super weekend, super race, would be Alfa Romeo. So Kimi Raikkonen finished 4th, and Antonio Giovanazzi secured his best ever result in Formula One by coming home in 5th. So both Alfa drivers were able to were promoted and took advantage of Lewis Hamilton's 5-second penalty. Second half of the season has been a real struggle for Alfa Romeo. They haven't exactly had the best of times, but with Kimi Raikkonen, like I say, finishing 4th, Giovanazzi finishing 5th, they were able to pick up 22 points from the weekend in Brazil, and that means that they're only 10 points behind Racing Point in the Constructors, so the battle for 7th place in the Constructors is still on going into the season finale at Abu Dhabi. So a really good weekend for Alfa Romeo. But yeah, no, great weekend, and Kimi Raikkonen finishing 4th, and Antonio Giovanazzi, who's, let's not forget, who's, for me, in my opinion, I think he's come on really strong in this second half of the season, has been getting the better of his more experienced teammates. So good on Giovanazzi for finishing 5th, and be intriguing to see how Alfa get on at Abu Dhabi. So coming on to Renault, so we touched upon Toro Rosso being close behind Renault in the Constructors. So Daniel Ricciardo, despite getting a 5-second penalty for sending Kevin Magnussen spinning in the race, Ricciardo finishing 6th as a result of Lewis Hamilton getting that 5-second penalty. So Ricciardo did finish the race 7th, but like I say, because of the penalty to Lewis, Ricciardo ended up finishing 6th. And after that 5-second penalty, Ricciardo was at the back of the grid, but you know what? He fought really well to get that 7th place finish, which then went up to 6th. And yeah, great race from Ricciardo. Some good overtaking from the Australian as well. But yeah, great result in the end for Renault, and really crucial points for Renault, because you look at what Toro Rosso achieved at the weekend in Brazil. Had Ricciardo not finished in 6th, then the points that it would be, I think if I'm right, then Toro Rosso and Renault would be quite close on points in the Constructors. So those 8 points, is it 8? I'm trying to work it out. So Ricciardo finishing 6th, so Renault were able to pick up some really valuable points in their fight for finishing 5th in the Constructors. Of course, they'll be disappointed not to have challenged McLaren even more for 4th in the Constructors, but the target now for Renault is to finish 5th in the Constructors. Disappointing and difficult weekend for Nico Hülkenberg. Brazil's usually a track where he usually goes well at, but for some reason he just wasn't able to dial in that Renault this weekend at Interlagos, and he ended up finishing way down the field. So not the way he would have wanted to end his penultimate race with Renault, Nico Hülkenberg, but no doubt he'll be looking to end his Renault career on a high at Abu Dhabi, and hopefully, fingers crossed, we're not seeing the last of Nico Hülkenberg. I'm a big fan of Hülkenberg, and I still think he's got a lot to offer in Formula One, so fingers crossed the weekend in Abu Dhabi is not his last weekend in Formula One. So coming on to Mercedes, a weekend where they were off colour, really. They didn't have the best of weekends. Lewis did qualify 3rd, so it wasn't a disastrous qualifying session for Lewis Hamilton, but in the race they weren't able to really get close to Max Verstappen. Didn't have the pace to match the Red Bull. And yeah, Lewis, although he did have some great battles, admittedly, with Max Verstappen, just wasn't able to get the better of him. And obviously, we saw what happened between Lewis and Albon at the end, towards the end of the race. And as for Valtteri Bottas, engine issues, which meant that he had to retire from the race. There were times where Valtteri was in a race of his own, really, but then before he retired from the race in Brazil, he did have a battle with Charles Leclerc. Whether this is a criticism, I'm not sure, but could he have been that little bit more adventurous in trying to get past Charles Leclerc? Could he have maybe sent one inside of Leclerc on turn one, because there were a couple of times where he was thinking about it, but didn't end up not getting past Leclerc at turn one. So there are one or two times where you just want Valtteri just to be that little bit more aggressive. Whether that's a criticism, I don't know, but I think as a neutral, maybe we want to see Valtteri be even more aggressive next season, but in a controlled way. But yeah, not like I say, not the best of weekends for Mercedes, but in sport you have your highs, you have your lows, and it just wasn't the best of weekends for Mercedes. As I keep saying, I need to stop doing that. But yeah, I've got no doubt that Mercedes will definitely want to bounce back in Abu Dhabi. Coming on to Racing Point, two valuable points for Sergio Perez and the team. Not the best of qualifying sessions for Sergio Perez and Racing Point. So I think he qualified 14th or 15th, the Mexican, but he was able to make his way through the field, able to make his strategy work, and he was able to finish home in the points once again, finishing ninth. And with Lance Stroll, so he was quite unlucky actually not to pick up some points. He had to retire unfortunately due to picking up debris from the Ferraris who clashed, which we'll come on to discuss soon. So yeah, really unlucky for Lance Stroll, because had he not been forced to retire, then he would have been in contention to pick up some points, and he was well placed to do that. So really unfortunate for Lance Stroll, but with Sergio Perez, two decent points for Racing Point, and they're going to the weekend at Abu Dhabi. Might be looking over their shoulders with Alfa Romeo, only 10 points behind them in the constructors. But I think Racing Point, if they can pick up a strong result in Abu Dhabi, then that should be more than enough to secure 7th in the constructors. So yeah, really good performance from Sergio. Obviously would like to finish higher, but two valuable points for Racing Point at Brazil. So coming on to Haas, and you know what, Haas, it was a weekend that started off really well for the team, with both Roman Grosjean and Kevin Magnussen qualifying in the top 10, and then it just seemed to go that little bit wrong in the race. So Kevin Magnussen, through no fault of his own, was sent spinning by Daniel Ricciardo, and that was the right decision for Ricciardo to get a penalty. I don't think, there wasn't a big enough gap for him to get by Magnussen, and I think Magnussen was always ahead. So K-Mag was really unlucky actually to get spun around, and he just missed out on the points by finishing the race in 11th. And I think with Roman Grosjean as well, without the safety cars, Grosjean was actually running in the points, and like I say, without the safety car coming out, Grosjean could so easily have ended up picking up a couple of points at least for Haas, but it wasn't to be for Haas at Brazil. But I'm sure that everyone at Haas will be wanting this season to end, because it hasn't been the greatest of seasons for the US based team, although they've got headquarters based in Banbury. But yeah, now everyone at Haas will be looking forward to 2020 and hoping that next season will be a much better season compared to 2019 season. So we come on to Williams. So like K-Mag, so George Russell just missed out on points by finishing in 12th. So it's always going to be a difficult weekend for Williams. It normally is anyway. But no, George Russell I think can because he will have learned a lot this season about himself, but also adapting to Formula One in his debut season in Formula One. And I think he's done a really good job, George Russell. I think he can hold his head high in terms of what he's been able to achieve. Just a shame he just missed out on points in Brazil. And Robert Kubica finished in 16th. We saw him being released unsafely and in coming out in just ahead of Max Verstappen in the pit lane. So Williams could have let Max Verstappen go and then let Kubica go by. Of course, I know that time and every second does count in Formula One, but you have to put safety first. And unfortunately, Kubica was released unsafely into Verstappen's path, which could so easily have led to a collision, but thankfully there wasn't. But we also know that Kubica's leaving Williams at the end of the season, and he has been linked with reserve and test drive at Haas, but also at Racing Point as well. I think Kubica would be a really valuable addition to either team, and I'd be interested to see how Kubica would get on in a Haas and Racing Point and see if he was given the opportunity to perform or drive in a free practice session during any of the Grand Prix weekends next season, to see how he'd get on. That would be quite intriguing, really, and I'd be quite interested to see how Kubica would get on. So the fact that he's linked with Haas and Racing Point as a reserve driver, maybe Kubica's career in Formula One is not over. Only time will tell. But I think Kubica, obviously, coming back into Formula One this season was a fantastic story, considering what has happened. Unfortunately, it just hasn't worked out. On his return. It's not been. Williams haven't had a great car this year, but we always knew it was going to be a struggle. But you know what, Kubica coming back to Formula One, I think, like I say, it's been a fantastic story. He can hold his head high in terms of what he's been able to achieve. Okay, not achieve as many points and great results as he would have liked, but him just coming back into Formula One is an achievement in itself. So he can hold his head high, and yeah, intriguing to see where Kubica ends up next season, and it could still be in Formula One. And then finally, we come on to Ferrari. Well, what do you say about Ferrari? No. First of all, you don't drive. If you're going to have a clash, you don't have a crash with your teammate. We saw Sergio Perez and Esteban Ocon have a fair few collisions with one another during time at Force India. And the thing is, though, with the incident between Charles Leclerc and Sebastian Vettel, it was avoidable. First of all, Leclerc pulled off a fantastic move at turn one on his teammate to take the position. But then going into the straight, Vettel then had DRS and then had the opportunity to get by his teammate. Could Charles have left a bit more space to let his teammate go by? I think personally there was enough space that Vettel could get by his teammate, but I feel that Vettel just turned left early once, and he didn't have that gap where he could get in front of Leclerc safely, and as a result, we saw Leclerc having to retire from the race, as did Vettel. And you would have expected to see Ferrari, at least one of the Ferrari drivers, to be on the podium. If not, could have even challenged for a race win, quite possibly, maybe. But yeah, look, Leclerc and Vettel, they are mature enough to deal with the situation, and they are. And like I say, it should not be happening. That they should not be, driving into. Well, I say driving into one another, but I think Vettel, with that ever so slight contact, had big consequences, and that resulted in both Ferrari drivers having to retire from the race. So really, it shouldn't be happening, especially at Ferrari. And but I'm sure they'll get it sorted out. Like I said, I think Vettel and Leclerc are mature enough to sort out their issues and make sure that it doesn't happen again. So that is the end, and that's all for the Brazilian Grand Prix podcast. Hope you enjoyed listening to it. If you want to get involved with the podcast, let me know by messaging me at Baggies20 on Twitter, and let me know what you think of the podcast, and I will catch up with you guys later. Have a great weekend, and hope you're all looking forward to the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix weekend. Take care.